Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to thank you to the House Committee on Science and Technology. I've got 4 minutes after. We're going to get started maybe at 5 or 6 after. I know some legislators are sort of filtering in, but we'll get started momentarily. Once again, I'd like to thank everybody to the House Committee on Science and Technology. We've got an agenda. First 5 minutes is sort of getting situated and giving an orientation. We may have another person or two that wants to stream in the next couple minutes, but in furtherance of that, we've got some speakers here who have some time constraints. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. Teeing up this issue, I appreciate everyone's presence here today. As I'd shared with some of the people that are going to be speaking earlier, sometimes when we as legislators and as committees ask questions, we know the answers to them. We're just trying to move towards a predetermined outcome. That's certainly not the case here. I don't know that the extent of the issue, but one issue that we do know, I think, as we've looked at over the last 5, 10, 15, 20 years is an increasing issue, is the use of technology to exploit people financially, to exploit people otherwise, exploit their privacy. And in some cases bring about very significant, very direct harm. And what our committee hearing today is going to really be looking to address is using the internet and technology to abuse/exploit people financially using a whole variety of means and methods. We understand the power of the internet and the power of technology. It's woven into our lives. Really, at no age can you be immune from that. It's not just young kids. It's not just people who are on social media. It's people really of all ages who are going about their lives in ordinary, in reasonable ways. And what we want to do in this, and what's been brought to me through a number of circumstances from people I know in the community to personal experience to other legislators, is to be able to highlight what's happening out there. Let's engage consumer advocates who see this, whose business and livelihood it is, to understand all the ways that technology and kind of our new 21st century marketplace is able to trick people or take advantage of them financially. And let's ask the question, are there state legislative actions that need to be taken? Are there federal actions that need to be taken? Are there actions that are already underway that are on a track to solve this, so we need to do absolutely nothing? Or are there a series of best practices that private sector and governmental entities can engage in just simply by making good decisions to stem the tide of these increasing issues? So again, as a Committee on Science and Technology, much of the work we do is outside of session, whether it's on voting technology, whether it's on bioscience, whether it's on cybersecurity, whether it's on autonomous vehicles. The breadth of this committee has been broad over the years, but I think as we look at what's in front of us now, not just what can be, not just looking at ways that can enhance quality of life in Georgia, but are there things today that are direct attacks on quality of life and fairness in our state? And that's really what our charge is today. Is there an issue? Is it an issue that addresses itself through any state response? And if it is, what might that response be? And if it's not, how do we as representatives of the public best engage in a targeted, focused, meaningful, and impactful way to bring about better outcomes. Because I think we're going to find today there's some outcomes that are quite shocking and quite disturbing. And I think we as legislators, as a citizen legislature, are very close to folks. We see this in our businesses. We see this in people we're around in the community. So we're listening carefully, and I want to have an opportunity for our committee to listen to some people that have some real expertise in this area, to look at people for whom technology is an essential part of their life, but that are being unfortunately taken advantage of by those who have a criminal intent. So with that, I'd like to go around the room. I'd like the members of the committee to identify, tell folks here who you are, where you're from, and that will kind of frame for people that are here maybe for the first time our committee.
Representative Sheila Nelson. I'm out of District 125, which is a good portion of Augusta and Hepburn, Georgia.
I'm Mary Margaret Oliver, House District 82, just middle of the tab, including all the University, Potatoes, Roanoke.
I'm Representative Viola Davis, House District 87, primarily in Tucker and Stone Mountain.
Again, Representative Ed Setzler, represent Northwest Cobb County, Ackworth, and Kennesaw.
Representative Pedro Marin, District 96, Gwinnett County, District Norcross and Duluth.
Representative Jody Lott, I represent District 122 in Columbia County, Georgia, just outside of Augusta.
Okay. And if you guys can pull those mics to you, I'm going to turn the mics on. We are streaming today. And folks that come and talk, if you can come up here, and I'll recognize you by the speaker mic here. That way folks that are watching us on the internet can enjoy this experience as best as possible. First on our batting order today is a consumer advocate that's known nationally and certainly as a favored son of Atlanta, or an adopted son of Atlanta, Clark Howard. Agreed to be with us today to talk about some of the things he's seeing in his realm of consumer advocacy. And I've not asked Mr. Howard to bring a comedy routine, although he leaves me laughing most afternoons I'm listening to him. But Mr. Howard, if you could join us at one of these two locations, I'll recognize you, and appreciate your being willing to share a perspective with us.
Thank you. I want to thank you and thank all the committee members for your interest in this, because I was frankly stunned when I was contacted by your office about this, because it's one of those things, we're beating our heads against the wall with this day after day after day, with frauds that the way you framed it's a little different than how we tend to, which is with an aging population, it's like our aging citizens have a bullseye target on them. And crooks are specifically targeting seniors. And the way we've dispersed as families, I don't know if each of you are in the situation I am, where we're scattered all over the country. And when my mom, who's now deceased, was aging, over time, her mental capacities shrunk bit by bit by bit, and she became vulnerable to people taking advantage of her. And imagine with me doing what I do for a living, my own mother gets scammed by people who took advantage of her. And so this is both personal for me, and then it's something that I see every day. We have a off-air advice center called Team Clark Consumer Action Center, and people can call in every day for advice or with complaints or trying to resolve problems. And so we track everything that comes in. And the issues involving people that are conning folks, especially senior citizens, it's just shouting at us. We've been tracking what people contact us about, either over the internet or by phone, since 1993. And the trend lines have really changed, where criminals they're like, what's the bank robber who said he robbed banks because that's where the money was? That's what's happening now with fraud, is with an aging population, more and more of the population being older, and senior citizens tend generally to have more money than people do that are younger. They're who folks are targeting so heavily. And I wanted to tell you, before I go specifically into the areas involving the frauds that are specifically the issue of this hearing, where are the areas that senior citizens are being hit most often? And this is really sad, but the number one area that we hear about is where they're having money taken from them by a family member or by a caregiver. And it is so tragic. You know, when you think about in families, you see the best in people and the worst in people. We always see that at weddings and funerals. You see this with issues of somebody aging, and it could be a daughter, a son, could be a brother or sister, takes advantage and takes money. And many times, again, because of us being spread around the country as adult children, it will be a caregiver who gains the confidence of the person they're providing care to, and they take money from them. And there's a series of problems with that are beyond my scope or ability to really know how you would legislate that or deal with those issues legally, because I'm not a lawyer. I assume many of you may be, but that's not my skill area. But it is something that we see over and over again. The other areas involve very heavily sale of insurance, and particularly annuities in bank branches and by insurance agents have become a terrible area of abuse of our senior citizens who are being sold completely inappropriate insurance products, particularly various versions of annuities. And there's huge money at risk that then is not available to an aging person who needs it for his or her life and care later in life, and it's basically been absconded by the bank or the insurance company. And it is something that just comes up over and over again. And so those are areas that are more, I guess you could think of them as areas that need institutional care, you know, that we need to have some method of providing additional protection to seniors. In the area of investments and insurance, a number of states have passed legislation that puts in place special requirements on a bank or insurance company to prove that a product was appropriate for someone past a certain trigger date. Could be 65 to 75 years old typically. And that is an area where there's a real need for legislation outside the scope of your committee. And the area with the relatives, I don't know how we make people better sons and daughters, but it is an area that I don't know how we bring the force of law down to see that doesn't happen. But when you move to the purpose of this committee and the hearing, the scams specifically targeting the elderly are not just based on the internet. You could be contacted by text message, you could be contacted by phone call, you could be contacted by email. And I bet there's not one of us here in this hearing room who has not been affected by somebody sending you something saying there's a problem with your account, or there's an issue with your Social Security if you're older, or whatever the area is they use as a pretext to contact you and say that you need to do something. It can be any of the different ways. And we track every single contact we get from a consumer every month. And the trends are really, really clear. The number one area that we're hearing from people are pretexts involving attempts at identity theft and using either email, texting, or phone calls, or a combination of all three once somebody takes the bait and responds, as criminals will come up with just about any story at all to attempt to steal your identity. And so the reality is we have made our lives too much an open book. Just before the hearing started, I was talking with a couple you'll hear from in just a few minutes that the role of social media in being a gateway for criminals to know what they need to know so that they can engage in attempting any of the crimes that will be part of the hearing. It's because of how much information we post about ourselves on Facebook, or that we share about ourselves on Instagram, or any social media. That is the gateway that gives the crooks what they need to commit so many of the crimes that they do. If you go back not that many years ago, a lot of the crimes were not very sophisticated or very targeted. But now they know when you were born, where you were born, who your family members are. They know your mother's maiden name. They know so much about you that it then becomes the entry point for them to then launch into whatever fraud they want to commit in your life involving trying to get to your wallet or your identity. So I have a chart here showing all the different ones, and I want to hit you with what's hot right now. Number one this year so far are what we put under the general heading of Social Security scams, where criminals use the information that they have gathered about you to try to convince you that there is some issue with your Social Security. And so they use your information to try to get you to then give them what they need to either steal your Social Security by redirecting your check, or to use the pretext of the call to get you to give them the information they need to steal your identity. So they'll use it as a way to get your Social Security number out of you. Say, oh, there's a problem. We're going to have to suspend your Social Security check. There's a problem with your record. And they will spend whatever yarn they can, either, again, through email trail, texting, or by calling you. And we have also had, this is really crazy in 2019, I don't even know what a stamp costs. Does anybody know what a stamp costs now? I mean, I never mail a letter. These crooks are even sending letters to people, pretending they look like they're from the Social Security Administration, saying there's a problem with them receiving their benefits, and they then make a phone call to what they think is Social Security that's actually to the crooks. And the crooks are able to get the information to do either thing. They're happy to either just steal your Social Security benefits by changing the direct deposit on them, or by using the information they're able to swipe from you and you calling them to steal your identity. And this is number one. We've done several TV stories on it. I've done a lot of radio content on it. We post on the web, but it keeps happening. And what will happen with this is eventually the word will kind of spread with people about what happened to this person, that person, the other person, and the criminals will move on to something else. But right now, this is the hottest, is the Social Security scam. And there's one that is not age specific, and I'm curious, show of hands, has anybody received an email, phone call, or text saying that there's a problem with your computer, there's a virus on your computer? 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. All right, so I got to 11. The hands just kept going up. So this one also works pretty much the same way, is you'll get an email that looks completely like it's coming from Microsoft. Or you'll get a phone call from someone who has some level of knowledge. They sound like somebody, if you've waited on hold with bad music to talk to tech support, they sound a lot like the person you talk to when they finally answer you at tech support. And they'll tell you there's a problem with your computer and that they can fix it. And they ask you for information that allows them remotely to take control of your computer. They take control of it, and then what they actually do is they have predicted the future, because then they put the ransomware on your computer and turn it into a brick. And so this is, many of you are nodding your heads, you're aware of this. Well, a lot of people aren't aware of this. And they get that call at a business or at home, and they give that remote access and control, and then the ransomware is loaded on the computer, and bam, they're out of business. So even if you pay the ransom to get your computer back, the problem is the criminals left code on there that they can track everything you're doing even after you paid them the ransom. And again, where that ultimately leads is either credit card theft, financial theft of some kind, or full-blown identity theft. So that's number 2 that we've been hearing about. And the IRS scam was really hot last year, not as hot now, where someone pretends either by sending you a letter on what looks like official IRS, computer-generated communication, or email. And the texting thing, who would ever think the IRS is sending you a text saying you need to talk to them? But people think that that's real, and they respond. And so with the scam, people are told that they have to pay their tax debt right now or they're going to jail. And the IRS may be a lot of things, but they're not swift. They're not doing if-then. If you don't pay right that second by store gift card or stored value card, you're going to jail like right away. It just doesn't work that way. But this one has been very effective, where people will then go to a retail store and they're told they have to buy store gift cards, or they have to buy some kind of stored value card, a Visa or MasterCard stored value card, and then give the codes over the phone to the person pretending to be from the IRS so they don't go to jail. And people do it again and again. And the thing that's the common theme that I want all of you to know is there is no one method of operation. There is no one method of contact. It is all of them. It's phone, text, email, and actual real letter in the mail. And by the way, nobody told me what a stamp is. Does anybody even know? None of us send letters anymore. You think it's 50? Okay. You do?
You wouldn't believe how people appreciate longhand letters these days.
Really? Okay. So the one that we're going to hear more about later is what we put under the category, and the law enforcement personnel also refer to as the grandparent scam. This is one of the most hideous, ugly things. If you ever wondered if there were sociopaths in this world, people who know the difference between right and wrong and don't care, the grandparent scam is the ultimate. So the criminals use social media to figure out who's related to who and how the chain works. And then they call typically a grandparent, great-grandparent, an aging parent, whatever, and they say your fill in the blank, your grandson, granddaughter, niece, nephew, whatever, has been in a wreck, has been locked up in jail, is in a foreign country in trouble with the law, whatever. And they tell you that you have to pay money right now or else. There's even occasionally ones where they get even more gritty and they tell you that your relative has been kidnapped. And they know, again, they know everybody's name. They know everything about the individuals involved in the family because of social media. They even have people who impersonate the grandkid or whoever the relative is. The contacts originally can start, again, any of the ways except letter, because there's this great sense of urgency, most often by phone. And they say, you better not call anybody, you have to pay us right now. And this is one of the weak links in the system that you'll hear again and again whenever you hear about frauds that are internet-based or any of these other ways. The criminal's gateway to money is almost always a store gift card, or it will be a Visa or MasterCard stored value card that you can go buy at Walmart or CVS, Walgreens, whatever. And so they're interested in electronics gift cards, and they're interested very heavily in, so like Best Buy, Home Depot, Lowe's, because things that are for construction and electronics are very easy for people to fence. So what the criminals want is they say, okay, so for $2,000 in Best Buy gift cards or Home Depot or Lowe's, whatever, we will release your grandson from jail or whatever. We'll let him out on bail or whatever. Or it could be where they spin a yarn with somebody in trouble overseas that, we'll take a bribe from you. So you can't tell anybody about this. Go buy the cards. And so I don't know how we fix the problem with the retailers. Because let's say somebody goes into Best Buy or Home Depot or wherever, and they go to the customer service desk, which normally I call customer no service, but today we'll call it customer service. And you go to the desk and you're buying these cards. The people behind the counter may sense something wrong, but they're not trained and they're not taught to do anything about it. And they just sell the cards. And then those cards, if you're not familiar, become instant transmittable cash. So the criminals will ask, let's say somebody buys the cards, they turn around and call the criminals back, who they think are police or lawyers or kidnappers or whatever, and they scrape off on the back the code. They give the code to the criminals over the phone, and instantly the criminals have that money and they can spend it in the store and buy whatever and then turn around and fence the merchandise. And so there's no way once that's happened to ever get the money back. If the criminals can con you into buying the Visa, MasterCard stored value cards, you can buy those for any amount of money that you put on them. You give that code to the criminal. That criminal has the ability to spend that money anywhere they want. And they can buy any kind of merchandise. But there's a little bit tighter security on those. And that's why the real weak link is the retailers selling their own gift cards that are being converted for these criminal purposes. And again, I don't know how you fix that. I don't know what requirement you put on them. If you remember many years ago, Western Union had a big problem with people coming in and buying wires in the various scams. This even predates all the stuff happening electronically with the cons. And they are under a consent agreement where they have to notify law enforcement and actually not allow the person to buy the cards if they sense that there's some kind of con going on, that the person is being put in harm's way financially. And I don't know how you would do that with how many different retailers we have, but best practices would be, since the electronic stores and the home improvement stores are so targeted by this fraud, that they in particular would come up with best practices internally where they train their customer service workers and have an internal procedure where they, before they would sell a large dollar denomination series of gift cards, that they would have some kind of protocol where they're nosy. The banks are now allowed to be nosy. And when somebody comes in wanting to do a large withdrawal of cash as an elderly citizen, the bank tellers have protection under the law to start asking questions before they process the transaction. It seems to me that the retailers, instead of washing their hands of it and saying, not our problem, need to be a line of defense in this.
Clark, I got a technical question for you that addresses that. What is the way to, if you were to take a retail store value card, I can understand how Visa cards would be sort of a more immediate cash. How does one monetize a stored value card? Is it a 80 cents on the dollar cash in kind transaction that happens like as a
No,
laundering scheme,
if you
or is it-
had the actual physical card from the victim,
Okay.
you could take it and put it for sale at a number of forums online where you tend to get, depending on how much people value the particular gift card, usually get between 80 and 90 cents for that card. Restaurant cards pull more like 70 cents. So as much as we like to eat, we don't value the cards as much. So most of the time, the crooks in any of these scams do not want to be seen and do not get physical possession of the card. That's why on the back of the card, there's the scratch off where you take a coin and you scratch off a code, and then that allows you to, let's say somebody has a Lowe's card that they've conned somebody to go buy. The criminal would then have you scratch the code off, and they'd say, okay, read that code to me. The criminal can then immediately go on Lowe's website and buy expensive professional grade tools, power tools or whatever. They set them up for either store pickup, usually, immediately go pick them up, and then they immediately can fence those tools and sell them on Craigslist or eBay or whatever. So they're not going to get anywhere near 80 or 90 cents on the dollar. They may get 50 cents on the dollar. But if you're able to con somebody out of thousands of dollars, you take that times 50%, you're still doing really well as a crook financially. So the key is that the cards are, because of the ability to shop on the internet, that's how these cards become instant cash to the crooks. And they can be anywhere in the country. They can even be anywhere in the world. And so that's why this is such a problem. But just think about what kind of lowlife would use tracking somebody on social media to then create terror in them that a family member's been in a car wreck, is in jail, is in trouble in a foreign country. I mean, we're really talking about real creeps. I really want to stop there because you get the gist and answer any questions anybody has for me, because there's a lot more. I mean, I do this for a living, so I could talk about this for a couple of days, but you'd all be sleeping.
Okay, Clark, thank you very much. I do have a question, and there may be more. Representative Davis, question.
Is it on?
You're not communicating right now.
Hello? Hello? It's not on. Can you hear me?
I hear you perfectly. I'm just worried anybody watching online isn't going to hear you.
I'm very concerned about the crimes committed against the elderly. Now, my own mother had her identity stolen, and her identity was stolen to obtain a student loan for online college. Have you heard of a lot of this going on with the elderly, having their identity stolen for like student loans, that kind of
Well,
thing?
it's not specifically the elderly, but we are hearing the problems with the federal student loan program, because do you know they don't require a social security number? You can assume anybody's identity I hope I'm not giving anybody ideas. You can assume anybody's identity. You don't even have to know background on them, social security, anything like that. You can apply falsely for a student loan. The federal government will send you the money. You can then use that money for any purpose. So what people will do is they will falsely register as you at a community college or something like that, triggering eligibility for student loans. They then do an application with virtually no information on the individual. They just use their name and apply for that loan. And then you don't even know about the loan because it's direct deposited into the false account till the bills start showing up that you have not paid for your student loan. This only works under the federal student loan program. So this is a problem that the feds are aware of, but there's the U.S. Department of Education is pretty disorganized right now, and they have not. This is way down their list of problems to deal with.
Thank
You have to prove, by the way, that you're not the borrower after it's happened to you, and that's a long administrative process.
Chair recognizes Representative Oliver. Question. Number 3? No? Okay. Who else has questions? Chair recognizes Representative Lott.
Thank you,
Sure.
Mr. Howard, for being here. So
Please call me Clark. Nobody calls me Mr.
Clark. I do listen to you regularly. It's so neat to hear your voice and see your face at the same time. So, one of those talk radio people. So, but anyway, so if somebody has used our credit card, what I have found in the past and what aggravates me to no end is that I can't find, they will not give me the address that the merchandise was shipped to, and it was my credit card. How do we get beyond that?
So the federal law is so protective of you when your credit card number is misused that you have virtually zero risk and minimal aggravation now, other than if you have automatic payments set up with the card. So the bank doesn't care about you knowing anything because they're the ones that get stuck with the cost of that. So they're never going to tell you anything. Even if you wanted to play Wyatt Earp and go figure out where the person is and what else they're up to, they're not going to help you because the bank looks at you as being irrelevant. It was just your 16 digits that were used. So they're not going to give you any of that information.
But equally so, they're not tracking that, and therefore it continues to happen. So if there's a specific restaurant in town and there's one waiter and he happens to have a drug problem, whatever it may be,
Right.
and consistently, because it does affect us. It affects us because how many of us actually write a check these days and put a stamp on it, right?
Right,
And send it.
right.
We don't. So it absolutely affects us to where now I've wisened up a little bit and I've attempted to have just a single credit card for automatic, payments on stuff. And then it's not the same one that gets used online for, whatever else, shopping and restaurants. But that was only after having to change Georgia Power, having to change water bills, everything that gets paid by them. So I do have this innate tendency to want to investigate it.
Right.
And are they going to? Because they're not helping by
No, they're not
ignoring it.
even. They're not even going to investigate it. So going back to the example you gave, so you have a drug addicted person at a restaurant, let's say, because a lot of it does happen at restaurants. People at restaurants are even paid to collect those numbers, and they pay $5. The crooks pay $5 per card, typically, that somebody skims. So we in the United States were the only country left that your card leaves your presence when you pay for something at a restaurant. I don't know if you know that. Everywhere else in the world, they have these little terminals they bring to you, and your card is always in your possession. So this crime doesn't exist anywhere else in the world. In the United States, the server, if you're at a sit-down restaurant, brings you the bill, you say, okay, you give the card over, they disappear with your card, and the criminal has an attachment to their iPhone or Android that they can swipe the card through, and they capture all the information from that card, and then they either use it themselves or they sell it. So a huge amount of the fraud is really the fault of, and we're the heart of payment processors in the United States. It's the payment processing industry that has not adopted the world standard of having those terminals, these little terminals that you go to the customer's table with. And then you zero out a huge amount of the credit card fraud. But they figure it out. The merchant processors figure out the answer to your question. Is it an employee at a particular restaurant who is, that turns out to be the source of continual credit card fraud? But then again, we're never brought in that loop because we're not really relevant to the process as far as they're concerned. But your idea, if you don't do this, it's great. You use one card for all online bill payments so that it's never used to shop anywhere, never used online for online shopping. It's only for payments. That way you don't have to change your form of payment with all those people when the card gets compromised. Very smart.
Real quick, Representative Marin, to recognize Representative Dreyer for a question.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And just to comment on one thing that Clark just said, since we are a leader in payment processings online, we really want to keep that. And it would be good for us to be innovative and try to get the law right in this area. Clark, so I deal, I'm a business litigator, and one of the things I see a lot is someone will do a phishing scam to one business, take over an email address and monitor it until there are wire instructions going, right? So we advise all clients to use a two-factor authentication and actually call and verify that. I mean, it would be great to get the word out. It would also be great, I think, to codify it. There's only a couple cases that have dealt with that in the country, but they go to a reasonable standard on which business had reasonable protections in their online systems. Now, when you're talking about consumers, I mean, that's just a whole different ballgame, though.
Sure.
Is there any good system that you would encourage consumer businesses to use that we could, you know, it'd be a little hard to legislate it, but certainly encourage it?
So the wire fraud is a huge problem right now. If anybody has sold a piece of real estate in the last year,
$50,000.
Oh, wow. Yep.
You got caught, but they modified the email. They somehow intercepted my correspondence with a beneficiary and tried to take $50,000 transfer I was making by wire. I learned a lot from that transaction.
so anytime you are selling a piece of real estate, call the closing attorney's office the day before the closing and verify the wire instructions over the phone, because they're getting fake emails telling them the wire instructions are different than they actually are supposed to be. And once that money goes, it's gone forever. I mean, it is gone. You're never going to be able to get it. They also do this to buyers who are paying their down payment for a transaction. What the criminals do is they lurk in the email accounts of real estate agents, and they know which closings are coming up and all that. They know who the parties are. And so the buyers end up with their down payment money being wired not to the proper place, the closing attorney, but to criminals normally overseas. And again, there's no recourse. The money's just gone. So verification by phone is really key as both a buyer and a seller of any real estate transaction 24 hours in advance to prevent that fraud. Because now we're talking, I mean, think about the cost involved with the down payment, let's say, 10 to 20% of the cost of a property. And if you're the seller, the money, the proceeds you're expecting, those proceeds go to the wrong place. You've lost the property and you've lost the money.
Clark, what we see is, $500,000 million in commercial transactions. And not only does somebody lose that money, but then you get a lawsuit between the buyer and the seller on who was responsible for that loss. And it's tough.
So, we use the wiring system we use. This is way too much to get into, but just so you know, the wiring system we use in the United States is really antiquated. The entire European Union uses a much more sophisticated system for moving money around that would eliminate the possibility of these kind of frauds. And I don't know why banking in the United States has not adopted the European protocol, because if you think about it, wire transfers are an extremely antiquated, not very secure method of moving money. And until we deal with that weak link, we're going to have to keep trying to come up with ways how we deal with the lack of security protocols there are around wire transfers.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Chair recognizes Representative Marin. Is it, could you push the button for me? Right there.
Thank you, Clark, for being here this morning.
Certainly.
And just to get this out of the way, the postage will be 55 cents. It's coming up 5 cents from 50 cents. So we all know that.
So go buy forever stamps quickly.
I know. So should I buy regular brand or should I buy generic? My
Always
question-
generic. You see, I have my Aldi water instead of this overpriced Coca-Cola product.
But really, and I see this as you call them crooks, and this is a global issue, and I see it a lot within the Hispanic community and the Asian community. My question is, when we talk about globally, what countries are we seeing these scams coming from to the United States? Because I know that Europe, Africa, but specifically
Very heavily Eastern Europe.
Eastern Europe.
Yeah, any of the computer-based scams, the ones involving the ransomware, have been very heavily from Eastern Europe, where there's a very large number of very highly trained professionals who can't find any jobs that pay any decent money. And so they gravitate towards running these cons, and many of them speak accented but very good English, and they've been able to, and you think about it, if you talk to tech support, often you're speaking to somebody who speaks English as a second language, and so it's completely credible that they would be tech support people. And so it's a lot of the Baltic states are involved in this, and Belarus and Ukraine as well, with a lot of the people engaged in the computer frauds.
And have United States have done any type of not agreement, but dealing with this, knowing that they're coming from Eastern Europe, Ukraine?
I don't know how you could. I mean, I don't. That's outside of my expertise.
Mm-hmm.
When you start talking about how it works with extraditing criminals, and it's very, very difficult.
Or even the government over there trying to put a hold on, stop this. Yeah.
But a lot of this is terrible to say, but a lot of the governments in Eastern Europe don't have the best rule of law.
True.
So it makes it really tough, and so I don't know how you stop those crimes at the source.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
That's an area where public education is really important.
Thank you.
Certainly.
Any further questions? Clark, I've got one. Could you shed any light on an issue? And if you can't, then perhaps some of the later speakers could. But the issue of the traceability. We talked about whether it's a stored value card through a retailer or a Visa card. If that's redeemed for products, is there not a way to connect the dots between a purchase that was made, of high denominated cards, high denominated cash cards of some kind, and the count that something, if it was redeemed, is there no way to tell that, or to track where those cards were actually redeemed and purchased? I mean, if there's if you're scratching off the back and you're reading a number, you should be able to track whether it's the IP address that accesses out of the internet, or whether it's transferred to an account, or even if it's cashed out for products. Is there not a way to be able to sort of follow that trail of breadcrumbs to the criminals?
I imagine, the problem for law enforcement is they've got so many different crimes they're chasing down.
Yeah.
And because these are not crimes against a person, they're not violent crimes, they're extremely low priority, and it involves multiple jurisdictions, and the resources for a local police department just generally are not there. So if you then look to the next level, which is federal law enforcement, they only devote resources when it hits a certain threshold that it's large economic losses. And unfortunately, often it's only going to be if a corporation is suffering the losses rather than individuals. So if you've got a variety of individuals who are losing $5,000 here or $2,000 there or whatever, you're not going to get a high priority action at any level of law enforcement. But if a corporation is, because of a fraud, is suffering huge losses, then you have the attention of a variety of federal law enforcement and investigatory agencies.
So it's the nature of being comparatively high dollar transactions, but low dollar in the big scheme of things.
Exactly.
In a number of circumstances, the nature of each one of those as being a separate investigation is sort of the pernicious nature of this.
Right. So let's say if Home Depot, Lowe's, or Best Buy, and I'm sorry I'm picking on those three retailers, but they're a big target for the crooks, that for them, and I should mention that Walmart is also one, but it's not as interesting to the thieves as places where they know they can fence goods for good money. You know, they don't lose any money on this. It actually makes them money because somebody's coming from outside buying these gift cards that are then money, that's already money in the hands of the retailer, and it's a guaranteed sale for them. So for the retailers, it's a reverse incentive. They benefit from the criminal activity instead of being a victim of the criminal activity. So how easy is it going to be, other than if it hits their moral conscience as a corporation, how are you going to get any of them interested in worrying about somebody who loses money because of a con game?
Any further questions for Clark?
That was so negative, sorry.
Well, you know, we're just trying to, we're just kind of dredging up what's happening out there and trying to understand what exists, and this is an ugly set of practices. Any other questions? Hearing none, Clark, we promised to get you out of here by 11 o'clock. I appreciate your being with us today.
Thank
very
you,
much.
y'all. It was really exciting to see your engagement with this because it's so frustrating for me, and you can hear it in my voice, seeing people get taken day after day, and to see you caring about this and wanting to do something about it is just wonderful. So I really appreciate it. Thank you. Thanks for the opportunity.
And again, where we are now, we're in the mode of taking notes and sort of understanding the issue. Sometimes it leads to a state response. Sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes it's agency. Sometimes it's legislative. Sometimes it's federal. I don't know that we know that yet. I think now we're trying to collect facts, and you've been a very important part of helping us do that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Y'all have a great day.
Had two committee members join us. I appreciate you guys being able to make it today. I know a lot of folks' schedules are challenged. Representative Scott, I'm told, we need to have her in our thoughts, had a minor car accident of some kind. I hope she's okay. I heard she understands she's okay and won't be able to make it today, but let's keep her in our thoughts. Representative Dreyer, we did, when we kicked off, introduce yourselves. Could you tell us a little bit about yourself and also Representative Turner?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. David Dreyer, I represent just down the street, House District 59. I'm a business litigator by trade, so I'm really interested in this issue. I see how it affects businesses. And I actually, unfortunately, have a meeting at the mayor's office in a couple minutes.
Appreciate you being here with us as much as you could, Representative Turner.
Scott Turner, State House Representative for District 21. I'm a nerd by trade.
Well, folks, appreciate your sticking with us, and appreciate Mr. Howard's presentation. Next, we've got Mr. Raymond Ralston, who is a victim, or his family member is a victim, and wants to present what happened in the case of his 85-year-old mother, who's lives alone independently. But Mr. Ralston, appreciate you being with us, and you've got the floor.
Picture of my beloved mother right here. I'm speaking for her today. And I'll say on the outset that Mr. Clark Howard be an impossible person to follow. But, you know, it's interesting that he basically said a lot of what I was getting at today with a real world case of a scam that was perpetrated on my mother.
Background on yourself and your mom,
Yes,
and
yes,
just lay the groundwork for.
Yep, I'm Ray Ralston. I'm not any known relation to the Speaker of the House, David Ralston, although my dad was born in Dahlonega and grew up some in Dawsonville, so we're probably distantly related, but don't think I have anything to do with Mr. Ralston. I'm 62 years old, and I retired earlier this year from a major United States corporation, and it was good that I did because I've been needed a lot lately, tracking some things down for my mom that I'll go into her story. I graduated from Georgia Tech in 1979 with a Bachelor of Science in Mechanical Engineering, and I'm a registered professional engineer in the state of Georgia. I'm the only child of Charlotte Ralston, and I'm representing her today, and her picture's here with me. I feel like she's right here. She wanted to be here, but I'll tell you a little bit about her. She's a retired widow, 85 years old. She's on a fixed income. She's been a model citizen, taxpayer, and a 62-year resident of Smyrna, Georgia, right in Cobb County in Ed's district. She doesn't suffer from dementia at all. She's very, very sharp. She does have congestive heart failure. She drives herself to the doctor. And she has her friends. They'll go out to eat. She gets her hair done. So she's an active citizen. But, you know, basically, I want to just get the point across that she's a mother that anyone would be privileged to have. She's been formative in my life, and I'm very thankful for her. So I feel like I'm, in a sense, defending her today and representing her. So think of her when I recount what's going on here. And I want to also, like Clark, thank the committee. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to share a real-world example of a really what's a pernicious thing. It's a bad thing. And I've been wrestling with this now since this happened, about 3.5 months. So I want to thank the Georgia Technology Committee for listening to this. The cybercrime is really bad, and it seems like it's getting worse. And, you know, someone like Clark said, it's the older citizens that don't understand digital commerce. They don't understand some of the things that are newly developed. They're still in a world of checks and cash and you know, and letters, so to speak. So I'm speaking on behalf of my mother. She was recently victimized by a criminal over the phone. She was defrauded of $10,000. In this case, the criminal or criminals impersonated her great-nephew, came on the phone, I'm in jail, I need bail money, crying, you know. It just so happened that what Clark said again was true. Probably Facebook, because he was calling her Aunt Charlotte, you know, and her was a great-nephew who is in the midst of trying to adopt his sister's son. So that kind of struck a real heart chord with my mother. You know, here he's crying, and she thinks she's talking to her great-nephew. And then an authoritative, quote-unquote, police officer comes on the line and starts making specific demands of her. Keep this secret. Do this. In Mother's case, she was instructed to buy $1,000 high-denomination Home Depot gift cards. So although she's kind of challenged with her heart, she was so compelled by this to do what was being demanded of her to help her great-nephew that she actually, on Friday, 5:31, they hit her in the afternoon late, making these demands, so that later that evening she got in her car and drove to one of the Home Depot stores and made 5 $1,000 transactions, buying 5 high-denomination $1,000 gift cards with her SunTrust MasterCard, which I might add had 0 balance for the whole year. And here all of a sudden that evening, she makes 5 $1,000 transactions to Home Depot. Now, I'll talk about Home Depot in a minute, but let me get to the other facts of what's going on. You know, she was instructed to do large denomination cards and to free her relative from jail. And then after the fact, she was instructed, as Clark said, to read those numbers out over the phone. She didn't realize that she has 5. It's interesting. Home Depot would only allow $5,000 transaction at one store. She had to go that night, and she couldn't get they were demanding $10,000. She had to go the next day to another Home Depot store and make another $5,000 charge. In this case, $4,000 was on her SunTrust MasterCard, and that maxed it out. So she had to write a personal check for $1,000 for the balance. That happened, okay? And she was not informed proactively of any potential scam. And it's interesting because after we did some personal investigation after the fact, we looked and went to one of the stores and went to the customer service desk, or not non-service desk as Clark likes to call it. Of course, Mother didn't go there to buy the card. She went straight through the checkout line, right? It happened that the clerk made the transaction and called the store manager over. And, you know, they asked her what was this for, and she said it was for a relative, okay? She was told to be secretive about it, so she didn't want to say any more than that. But they didn't proactively warn her, hey, there's scams out there. What we found out later after the fact, and I don't want to go into a lot of detail. I could get too detailed here. I wanted to be prepared. But Clark said speak from the heart, so that's what I'm trying to do. We went to those stores, and one of the stores at the customer service desk, on the desk, had a little sign stuck to the desk describing this exact scenario. You know, if you purchase high denomination Home Depot gift cards, don't give these numbers out to criminals. Because Mother didn't realize when she read those numbers out over the phone, she was taking a card that she had bought and she was monetizing that to the criminal who could put that. And actually, she made some mistakes. Being the age that she is, she made some mistakes reading the numbers out. And the criminal would put it in and know, because he was on the internet actively trying to redeem that card and validating it as she was doing it, reading them out to her. So, you know, it was basically these cards were instantly monetized in $1,000 on the internet to validate the whatever, you know, the fact that the crooks had the money and they took the money. Mother didn't realize, and then they said, shred the cards. She did exactly what she was told, okay? So that, she made $5,000 on one night, went back the next day to another Home Depot, and made $4,000 on a credit card, maxed out the card at $9,000, and a personal check that, interestingly enough, was automatically routing number debited immediately. It was checked, it was taken out of her checking account immediately, because that's how they process checks now, is with a debit transaction scenario. Okay, so all that happened. Later, that's Friday evening, Saturday morning. I talked to my mother every day. She didn't mention anything about it on Friday. Saturday, she went and fulfilled the obligation to the criminal. And later that night, she didn't hear anything from him. That person had called my mother 20 times to do all of this, just consistently, firmly, you know, basically controlling her over the phone, which is a sad thing. And like Clark said, these people have to be just the worst people in the world that perpetrate things like this. So all of that happened, and then later on Saturday night, she started thinking about, hey, this $10,000 is a lot of money for people that are on fixed incomes. She calls me finally and says, I've done this. Well, what's going on here? And I said, Mom, you should have called me up front. This is probably a scam. So I drove over to my mother's house. Later that evening, it was Saturday night. This is one and a half days into this thing, or maybe, you know, one and a half of that being the evening, like 10 p.m. at night. I call SunTrust, MasterCard, and start disputing the claims, or disputing the charges. I said, my mother's been scammed. And they took that. They pursued the fact that it was, these charges were disputed. The $1,000 was gone because it had already been pulled out of my mother's checking account, so that was not a point. But the point I want to make here is I tried to pursue it pretty quickly, a day and a half in. Monday morning, I said, Mom, we'll go and report this crime. We went to Cobb County Police Department. They said, you've got to go to the Cobb County Sheriff's Office. We went to Marietta Square and filed a complaint. And the woman was very honest, a very sweet lady there at the front, and said, this is a complaint. Now, I've got all the information here, the numbers, I won't read them out to you. But basically, they took the crime report, but said, there's really nothing we're going to be able to do here. It's just you're reporting the crime. So in the midst of the next few days, I did a Federal Trade Commission report I went that same day, that Monday, we went from the Cobb County Sheriff's Office to SunTrust. I opened a fraud complaint at SunTrust saying, I talked to your, SunTrust MasterCard Saturday night, we're disputing claims. I want to make a formal fraud case report to you. And I talked to one of the managers. We did that. Later on, I did a presidential escalation to SunTrust, which I've done all of that. And really the sad thing is, out of all that effort, it's just total silence. It's crickets. Nobody really cares. And that's where I want to kind of take from where Clark left off is, I want to show you the human side of the after effects. That when something like this happens, nobody helps. Nobody's there. I wrote two.
Mr. Roll, you've not been told no, though, correct? This is still an open case.
Yeah, it's still an open case. I haven't heard anything. Just crickets, so to speak. I haven't heard anything yet. But I want to state this because it's not just my mother. I read Clark, one of his articles. He's very humble. He probably wouldn't say, but I started getting into this situation. I didn't know that much about it. Well, I mean, it was a $41 million scenario last year with just I think they're calling it the grandparent scheme. In this case, it was a great nephew. And that's just what's reported to the Federal Trade Commission. So it's a lot worse than whatever 41 million. It's rampant, okay? And so we did everything we were supposed to do in terms of reporting the crime, etc. I wrote two letters, one to Home Depot's executives, CEO and/or VP Customer Relations, and a letter to SunTrust, which SunTrust has gotten back to me, but the officer level has not contacted me back yet. I was told that she would. She didn't. We called her, left a voicemail with Mom there. I wanted Mom there to be, part of the equation. A lot of times it's hard as a son. That's another thing. They won't talk to the son. They've got to have the mother there. It's the mother to validate, which she did. But basically, what I want to also bring out is the fact that, where was SunTrust in the sense that where was the security on this card where Mother made 5 $1,000 transactions on Friday night? There was not a call. There was nobody saying, what's going on, ma'am? You haven't used this card in a year. What are you doing, And I think it would have kind of shocked her into, and they too need to see, these are the same company. High denomination gift cards are a blight. They can be leveraged by these criminals, and they know they can get away with it because, as Ed was alluding to, Mr. Setzler, it's hard to trace. How do you track some of these people down? I think there needs to be controls there. I'll state a little bit about that in a minute. But we followed up with SunTrust, and ironically, and again, he hit on this, and I want to emphasize, SunTrust is going to profit by her use of these cards. We owe $9,000, and I told her, don't pay that money. We don't feel it's legitimate, okay? I'm still protesting the fact that I thought my SunTrust MasterCards were insured. That card has 15.24% annual interest on it, okay? If you were to invest money at SunTrust, what would you get? 1%, 2% on your money? I thought part of that high interest rate was for fraud coverage. Well, we did get a letter back from SunTrust saying, it's probably a canned letter. They did investigate the fraud, but your mother was present and or profited by these transactions. Well, how did my mother profit by this? She owes $9,000. And isn't it ironic now that nothing was heard that Friday night? They could have saved her $5,000 on Saturday. If they'd have brought her to her senses earlier, it had been half the amount, right, instead of the full $10,000. But it didn't happen. Are they calling now? You better believe it. I've even talked to them. Collection department, SunTrust, MasterCard, why aren't you paying your bill? I have a complaint into your executive branch, and I'm not hearing anything back from them. Mother's already been charged $144.21 interest for the first month on that $9,000. So her use of that card's really going to end up earning money for SunTrust. And like Clark said, it's counterintuitive. It's ironic. So Home Depot made $10,000 gross sales on 5/31 and 6/1. What do you do about this kind of thing? Silence on the part of the retailer and the bank. You know, to me, in a decent world, since I wrote these letters and appeal, I asked Home Depot to say, these high denomination credit cards are being used by criminals and being leveraged as tools to fleece the public out of money. I feel like you ought to refund the $10,000 to my mother. And again, he hit on it exactly. And I have a number of takeaways, but this is one of them. It's like, as long as the grandmothers and grandfathers, the esteemed culture that we have that was built on these kind of people, as long as they suffer these losses and these big companies are not losing but gaining from the situation at hand, you know, it's a sad thing. It's a really, really sad thing. So, you know, what are my takeaways from this? Again, I asked for the $10,000 purchases to be refunded to my mother. Why? Because, you know, we went to the customer service desk. They knew that this is happening and it's rampant. Why weren't the clerks? Why wasn't the store manager? Why weren't they trained by Home Depot? And I know it's others. I'm not trying to pick on Home Depot. It was just the agency of what happened here. Why don't they train their people as a public service to be proactive, to verbally, ma'am, that's all well and good. This is for a relative, but you need to know there's scams going on. You know, people are using these things to steal money from seniors. I think it would have brought her to her senses. I think she would have backed out early, and this wouldn't have happened. But as it is, you know, the crooks got the money, and they used high denomination gift cards to perpetrate that. Who buys $1,000 Home Depot gift cards? Who buys 10 $1,000 Home Depot gift cards as a private citizen? No one was there to help my mom. So again, another point. I thought SunTrust MasterCards were insured. Is this not a case of fraud? It's blatant fraud. It was a scam. My mother owes, she lost $1,000 immediately. She owes $9,000 right now on that card. And it's accruing interest, okay? Each month is accruing interest. So SunTrust is profiting. Home Depot is profiting by $10,000 worth of sales. And here's the public suffering. It's just wrong. It's bad, okay? I've asked that question of SunTrust, and I haven't got an answer yet, other than the canned letter that she participated and or benefited from these transactions. Again, I wanted to reemphasize, SunTrust wasn't there up front on Friday night, but they certainly calling now to collect the money, big time.
And Mr. Ralston, I don't think you're saying that it's one bank's issue over another bank.
That's true too. Thank you for bringing that up.
I mean,
I'm personalizing this.
I'm certainly sensitive to names of businesses coming up, and it's more general. But
I'm already counting the facts of her case. You're right. It's probably all the banks. It's probably all the retailers, as Clark said. I don't want to mischaracterize. I'm trying to just detail the facts of her case. Thank you for bringing that up. But the fact that SunTrust is charging such a high interest rate, and surely there's scam and fraud insurance built in there, why can't these charges be excused from SunTrust's standpoint? Bank manager told me they would be up front, but after the fact, we got all these canned letters and no communication from the executive branch. You know, and I've had a long time to think about this, 3.5 months, you know, and I'm into this process. It was a miracle that I was able to testify before this committee, so I thank the committee again for listening to my case. But you know, the wheels start turning. I don't think like a criminal, okay? I'm a technical person, I'm an analytical person, but I don't think like a criminal. But you know, there's got to be a large black market out there. From an internet standpoint, like Clark was saying, they're selling these things. Why there's no control over something like that? I think we have an opportunity from the state of Georgia standpoint, and I'm glad, Ed, you asked the question. You got to a lot of the things I had written down. It's like, how do you identify who's claiming these things? You buy them. You know who buys them. If you have $1,000 gift cards and multiple ones, how do you identify who's cashing those in? That's getting at the root of the crime. And that's where we need to get to. Instead of just ignoring this stuff and letting our forefathers bear the brunt of the economic burden until big corporations, in this case, Home Depot and SunTrust, but probably in other cases, Lowe's, all the Walmart, all the retailers, all the banks. But how do you get in there and control this? That's the challenge, I think, of this committee. But there needs to be control. I had saved up a bunch of money before I retired, and I deposited more than $10,000 cash in my savings account that I'm using now to live off of to a certain extent. I had to fill out a form with the federal government to identify who I was, what the money, what is this money doing, even depositing it, much less not pulling it out. High denomination gift cards are being used by the criminals because once they get that digital number, 15, 20 characters, whatever it is, and that money virtually goes out of an elderly person's hands and into the criminal's hands, there's no control. Nobody knows what's going on after the fact. That needs to stop because I think, in the case of high denomination gift cards, I know smaller gift cards, you couldn't talk somebody into doing $520 gift cards, but with higher denomination, there seems to be a certain amount of money that, hey, you've got to have some controls here on who cashes these out. How is it, whether it's the IP of whoever is in there doing the internet scam, or if they're, however they're doing it. I'm sure they're not going to the store with just a virtual number. But somehow there needs to be identification after the fact. And if the companies really care, they'll go to that. I like the point they were talking about best practices. The companies need to try to self-heal. They need to develop a means that they can control the use of these cards. The fact that they're being used as leverage by criminals, that needs to stop because they see it so easy and they jump into a rabbit hole on the internet and they're gone. That's really bad, and it's being used more and more. That's basically my story. I could go on and on about my mom. She needs help. She deserves that help.
Mr. Ralston, and there may be some questions of committee members for you too while you're here, but would you be willing to take some questions?
Sure, absolutely. Anybody. I've got a lot more details here. I just didn't want to start reading it to you and boring you.
I sense you probably do. I'm going to let them ask some questions, and I'll let you maybe wrap up at the end.
That's perfect. Thank
Chair
you.
recognizes Representative Lott for a question.
Thank you for being here, and I am very sorry for what you've been through. I know that's difficult and takes a lot of time to work through. My question for you is simply, do you believe that if the higher denomination cards had a label similar to what you said you saw on the desk that said that these are fraud, there's a tendency for fraud in this?
That might help.
Do you think that your mother would have recognized that?
I think she might have. If it were on the card, that's a good point.
Because we've moved to that with cigarettes and with alcohol and pregnancy effects and cancer effects on certain things. But I was just wondering, and I'm not into, I hate mandating things on private companies, but
Right.
certainly you could put out something that, are you willing, would you be willing? If we brought it up as more of a, consumer advocacy type
That's
thing,
right.
these higher denomination cards could simply have a label on them, or certainly when you're about to scrape. But when you get into the elderly too, there's a second conversation about, are they reading these cards? Can they see these? Because I can't read them without my glasses on.
That's a good point.
But and they're small, so but certainly I would have to have my glasses on to read that number I was about to give somebody.
Right.
So, but you believe that possibly she would have then recognized?
Well, she can read and she understands, right? I think I have been to I shop at Home Depot all the time. I'm not trying to diss this company. It's a great company. It's a humanitarian company. It gives, it helps. It's a good thing. It's a good company, don't get me wrong. I've been to other Home Depot stores where, not the two that I mentioned that Mother used, but I've seen labels also at the gift card rack at the bottom. But my mother shared with me that she was shaking when she was in the line. She was scared. She has never done anything wrong. She's never been arrested. She's as sweet as she can be, okay? She's a Southern general, older lady, okay? She's a model person. I am what I am because of her. And, the bottom line to it is she may not have read that. Now, if it were on the card, I think she might have read it. I think, to me, from a company standpoint, I think, this is just me thinking in my opinion, but the companies need to be a lot more active in their training of their employees to be proactive for public service. Say, this looks wrong on the face. I think actually the people that did her transactions knew something wasn't right. They asked her, it's for a relative, that they dropped it. They made the sale. Ma'am, you know, you need to be aware that you might be buying these for your multiple grandchildren, but you need to be aware there are scams right now being used by criminals to take money from elderly people. That would have stopped it right at the checkout counter. So maybe on the card, but you know, really, I think I don't want us as a society to, and I'm a technical person, so this is ironic for me to say, I don't want us to lose that interaction with each other. Somebody knowing the facts and helping and reaching out and just making a statement can help people, and it would have helped Mom in this case. But that's a great point. You know, having, you know, like you're saying, cigarettes and other things, having a sticker or something on those high denomination cards might be a best practice solution for a Home Depot or a Lowe's. I'm not sure, but that's a thought.
Certainly, it was just a thought. I certainly don't believe that it would. We're not going to protect everyone because it is our responsibility, of course, at that point to read it and to think. I think you're right about personal interaction. I think that's something that's going to actually get somebody's attention is when we stop sitting back, recognizing danger, and we all sit back and think, "Wow, I shouldn't say anything because I might offend somebody."
That's really
And we're doing too much of that right now in any circumstance, not
my problem,
not just fraud. Yeah.
But ironically, then, you know, the store manager for one store got a $5,000 boost in his gross sales that day, and the other one the next day. So it's counterintuitive. It's ironic, like Clark was saying, that these companies are actually profiting by the criminals, and that's really a bad cycle. That's a bad thing. Thanks for that question. That's a good.
Representative, any further questions?
No, thank you.
Okay, Chair recognizes Representative Oliver.
Thank you very much for being here. Because of my law practice as conservatorship for disabled and older people, I've seen every kind of scam there is.
I bet.
And it's always interesting to me that it is very frequently the $11, $12 an hour person on the front line that stops it. Yeah. More often than not, more often than the executive policies.
Right.
And I'm always grateful to that person. Tell me, you said there was a $5,000 limit on the purchase of high-dollar cards daily. Was that a bank policy or a Home Depot policy?
It was, as far as I know, it was a Home Depot policy. That's a good question. I don't know. It mystified me why she could only do $5,000, even though it's $1,000 gift cards. It still doesn't add up.
Which leads me to the question of, what does Lowe's do? And is there any state that has limited the amount of a high dollar value card daily sale limitation? Or is that totally a federal issue? I'm sure there are lobbyists out there for the retail industry that can know the answer to that question. Do you happen to know?
No, ma'am, I don't. But I think what you're bringing up is very interesting. Because
if Home Depot has an internal policy of only $5,000 a day, then they could have a Home Depot policy of $500 a day.
That's a great
and
point.
Save $30 million of the $40 million scams.
Right.
That's where my mind is going.
No, that's a good. That's
but if I'm interested in the retail industry, how many of them do limit the high dollar cards per day, and why do they do it? At what point did that policy become implemented for the purpose of protecting their consumers?
That's a great question. I don't know the answer to it, but I do know that here it was that Saturday night she had made that other $5,000 that morning. She confesses, I don't want to say that. She talks to me about this, and I was like, "Mom, you've been scammed." And that night, how did that all that money get booked in a day and a half? To where these cards are paid off by MasterCard so fast without any verification or security.
And I am called, and I'm sure many of us in this room are called frequently, is it true that you made this purchase at this time of day? Right. So there are safeguards that the retail industry is adopted. I don't think that's mandated. Correct me if I'm wrong. But why is it in this instance for the high dollar value card that there's not an intervention as there is when somebody... If I'm on vacation in Maine, they're going to call me and say, "Did you really make this charge in Maine, because I don't happen to live in Maine. And
To the lady's question,
do you know the answer?
No, I don't. That's part of what we're looking into. I mean, to your question, and I don't know if I've shared this with others. I was at a prominent home improvement retailer within the last year. I think it was actually the 2018 campaign. I was buying some campaign materials. I think I wrote a check for something like I'm just going off memory, $450, $460 to buy some signposts and things for campaigns, and it flagged and said purchase denied.
Right.
And I said, well, why is it denied? I mean, I had plenty of dollars in the account. And they said, well, it's outside of the spending profile for your account. Your account doesn't write paper checks for these kinds of things in this location, in this place. And it was a nuisance. I was a little mad at first, and I thought, well, this is the system working. They're trying to protect me. So I went back and got my debit card and came back and completed the transaction, because that was sort of within the boundaries. But there are firewalls that are out there that I think the industry puts in place for good reasons.
For much less dollars than what happened to your mother.
Which is why it surprised me that,
Because
again,
they're making money there. And see, they would not be making money if I said I didn't charge these sign things. See, profit there, no profit there.
well, no, I mean it's a $400.
Am I right?
It's a $400 retail transaction versus a $5,000 retail transaction, as I see it.
But you could contest that. If somebody had fraudulently bought your staple guns,
Yeah.
you could say, I didn't buy the staple guns, and they would take it off your bill. But this transaction is not taken off your bill. So this is where my mind is going. Where is the industry protecting itself when it's going to lose money, where it has no interest to protect itself over here? But somebody imposed a $5,000 limit, and I'm curious about that.
That's a great question.
And to the lady, I don't want to ascribe motive.
I know.
But as we step back and ask the question, there are systems in place that I've seen work personally, to my personal inconvenience, but ultimately to my ultimate good, that makes me believe there's a very sophisticated system out there.
And it was their personal interest, though. You see, Home Depot was acting in their personal interest, or Lowe's, or whoever it was, Ace Hardware, to stop your transaction. But they they didn't have to act in their personal interest for his mother. If I'm really asking this to see if I'm understanding this correctly. And if I'm understanding this correctly, then it leads myself to be thinking, where else are we imposing these limits for the sake of the consumer as opposed for the sake of Home Depot?
I think those protections, I never thought of it before, but for the last 3.5 months, it's come to bear in my mind more and more that there needs to be some controls like that. There has to be, because this is ramping up. It's happening. It's happening in a lot of
I
people.
want it to be in Home Depot's self-interest.
Yeah.
For those controls, as it is for your staple gun purchase.
Right.
And I say that to the lady because I know the sophistication exists and the processes are there, where they have algorithms that run that say, okay, does this meet the risk profile? You know, we'll have, again, like we're on vacation, something shows up.
And I think that's retail imposed. I don't think that's FTC imposed, but those lobbyists out there would tell me if I'm wrong about that.
I think it is, but what I'm trying to understand is, I'm not sure what the threshold is for fraud, what even legally, what constitutes a duty for the consumer versus the financial institution versus a retailer. We're trying to get in to understand those things. I'm not sure I can answer that right now.
But thank you. You've generating a discussion here about consumer interests that's very positive. Thank you.
Yeah.
Chair recognizes Representative Davis. Question. I'm sorry. Is your mic on? You got it.
Okay, thank you. I wholeheartedly so sorry for what happened to your mother and what your family is going through. I worked in the retail industry for a while and retired from there. And there are some measures in place. I recall just a few minutes ago we were talking about had she been informed. I know there are some limits on things that people can do. Of course, the criminals know that too. I think the criminals know the rules and the laws and the practice better than anybody. And they kind of change, and sometimes I believe we allow the criminals to dictate the next step, the next move, the next this. But unfortunately, sometimes our seniors don't listen to us as the retail person. They will come in, you will tell them, because the place that I retired from, we actually had a limit how much you could spend at one day. However, she went to more than one location. So that there are some rules in place, but sometimes people ignore the rules because her focus was on the phone call and the commitment because she thought she was helping a relative that was about to be freed.
Yes, ma'am.
So sometimes we can put all the rules in place. We got to be real specific about how we go about doing it. And that's what I think, even when you have limits in place, sometimes they're not seeing, they can't see the forest for the trees, in so many words. So I think this is a good conversation for all of us to be having. We all care about all of our loved ones, especially our seniors. We all want to be seniors one day. But I think at some point in time, we have to accept reality. And I for one, would say we need to maybe bring the retailers or the lobbyists and, come to the table, continue this conversation, because you can see the millions on the table, if not eventually the billions. So it's nothing that's going to go away. At one point, people was doing, like I said, the wire frauds and everything. At one point, they were doing cashier checks and money orders. They've gotten much more, the criminals have gotten much more sophisticated because I want it and I want it right now. I don't have time for you to mail it to me. I don't have time for you to wire it to me. There's a limit on this, there's a limit on that. So sometimes we've got to make sure now we're not letting the criminals dictate what the next moves and the next steps are.
Thanks, Representative Nelson. Chair recognizes Representative Turner.
Thank you, Mr. Ralston, for being here today. That's a great point that Representative Nelson just made about allowing criminals to dictate. And as I was listening to your story, I see 5 actors here. I see your mom, who's the victim, the criminal scumbag who took advantage of her, the store, the bank, and law enforcement. And I want to drill down specifically on your experience with law enforcement and being told there wasn't much that can be done. Can you describe the level of detail that was provided to the sheriff's office?
I have the actual reports. I have the actual Federal Trade Commission report that I opened, copies here, and the Cobb County Sheriff's Department. So they wanted to know what happened, who it happened to, residency, that kind of detail. But it was interesting because I looked at the little sign-in sheet to talk to the person that then gave me the information to fill out. And that prior day, there was no less than 10 people in there, the same thing, fraud. That, it's like, I think the lady was basically communicating from a real human standpoint, this is bigger than us. We can't, the money's gone. We're not going to spend a whole lot of time investigating this. I don't fault them for that, but then when I go to the time of making a police report and making a Federal Trade Commission report, SunTrust fraud case, I don't expect form letters back. I expect human treatment, letter, something real, somebody to talk to me. I gave my phone number to these letters when I wrote SunTrust and Home Depot. Haven't heard a thing.
So were you assigned an investigator at all?
No.
Has anybody reached out?
Well, there may be a name on the report that is, to that person. No, I haven't had no feedback as to any actions taken.
Any effort to try to trace the phone call back to its source?
No, sir, not at all.
Not by any law enforcement tool or agency?
No, sir.
And I think this highlights, for me, probably part of the problem and something that we need to be doing better, and that's giving our law enforcement community tools and resources to attack this. Representative Nelson used this phrase, we allow the criminals to dictate. And when we throw our hands in the air on a specific type of crime and say, we're not even going to bother spending resources when somebody was taken to the cleaners for $10,000. I mean, how bad does a crime have to be before we start giving law enforcement the resources they need to start tackling a problem? Because as a lawmaker, we've made this illegal. I mean, what happened was a crime.
No.
Probably several dozen crimes in this one instance. So the fact that as a lawmaker, the best thing I can do is pass a law.
Mm-hmm.
But then I had this obligation to make sure that law enforcement has the tools that they need. And I think that's probably an area of discussion that we need to explore, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Thank you.
Any further questions? Mr. Ralston, appreciate you being here with us. Any wrap up for us?
I just, I don't normally do this kind of thing whatsoever. I'm retired now. I live at home. I try to get more exercise. I'm trying to lose some weight. But to be able to be in the front of this committee and share my mom's story has been an honor. And to meet Clark Howard, this is a horrible, it's getting more prevalent, just a small little aside. While I was typing the letter to SunTrust on my computer, I got a call on my mobile phone. I answer the phone. Well, this is the Social Security Administration. You know, your card has been compromised. You are going this and that. I knew immediately myself it was a scam. But I mean, what are the chances of me writing a letter about a scam that occurred to my mother and me get hit with a scam on the phone while that happened? It's amazing. That means it's happening more and more. And I trust this committee to make some really probably good recommendations about how we're going to control this. But, and the bottom line, these high denomination gift cards, there's got to be a lot bad going on with these things going on. I'm telling you. You think about it. If there's no control at the end, what are these black market people doing? What might terrorists be doing? How does all this play in together? It's bad to our public, and I know that's what you folks are charged with. And again, that's why I thank this committee for the opportunity to voice my mother's concerns. Thanks again.
Appreciate your time, Mr. Ralston. Appreciate you being with us. I've got 11:40. We are just about 10 minutes or so, 5 minutes behind schedule. So we're pretty close. I'd like to thank some representatives of the Atlanta Field Office of the U.S. Secret Service who are with us today. This issue is actually typically investigated by the U.S. Secret Service. These kinds of issues, they're not typically state resources that are brought to bear on a day-in, day-out basis, I'm told. But with that, I'd like to recognize our representatives from the U.S. Secret Service. Come speak to us, help us frame the issue, perhaps. I know it's broader than the things we've talked about today. It's broader cyber crime. I know you're part of the cyber unit.
Yes.
Some of these fraud investigations are outside your department or sort of overlap your department as well as others. So given what you've heard today, how could you frame this for us? I just want to kind of give you some open mic time to speak to that. Maybe we can address the issue of resources, where these things are best addressed. Is there a state role? But with that, I'd like to thank you for being with us.
It's a lot in 20 minutes.
And,
Chairman Zetzler, thank you for the invite, and members of the committee, thank you. On behalf of my agent in charge, Kimberly Cheadle, and Assistant Special Agent in charge, Malcolm Wiley, again, thank you for the opportunity to share a little bit about what we're doing from the law enforcement perspective. I do have some prepared remarks. I've been taking copious notes from the speakers, and so I'd like to address some of the things that Mr. Howard, or Clark Howard, sorry, and Mr. Rawls addressed as well. So I kind of may go off script a little bit to address some of the things that have been brought up and give you a little bit of a law enforcement tint. I began my career about 26 years ago in law enforcement right here in the city of Atlanta. I was a city of Atlanta police officer. I grew up in most of my life in Georgia, Norcross, from the gentleman's district here. Came back to Atlanta after college and served with the City of Atlanta Police Department for my first 3 years, and then began a long tour with the Secret Service for the last 23. I spent over 12 years in D.C. on the President Obama and President Bush details, and in 2013 in January I came back to Atlanta and got back on my investigative hat and have taken over our cyber unit that we have here in Atlanta. I learned a long time ago that good managers surround themselves by good people. And I have a great team of people that are much smarter than me and technical than me that do cyber investigations. Specifically, we do network data breach investigations, large-scale data breaches on private industry. We do network intrusions at private companies. We do forensic examinations on computers and cell phones and that type of thing. And a lot of what I'm dealing with right now in our unit is ransomware, business email compromise. Some of these things have been discussed. And they do impact the elderly too. So there's a nexus there in what I'm doing. The carding side, we have an organized fraud unit that does a lot of that stuff, but I can address some of those things as well. I also want to add that I'm a parent of 3 kids. And I got to tell you, as teenagers and younger kids, and a father who's elderly, I think my greatest challenge is learning from them and how they try to hack around my protocols on their phones and their devices. I learn a lot from my kids, actually, believe it or not, and my dad. So they keep me on my toes with the internet and whatnot, too. So I learn a lot there. So, in fact, I can share some of the things that have gone on there that tie into this very well. Just by way of introduction, the Secret Service, most people think, earpiece, sunglasses. Why are you even here? The Secret Service, we began as an agency doing counterfeiting. Okay, so we were a counterfeiting agency. Our mission has kind of morphed over the years. We didn't actually pick up protection until McKinley was assassinated in 1901. A lot of people don't know that. And our investigative mission, we now are a dual mission agency. Our investigative mission has morphed into the financial area. When I began 23 years ago, the credit card fraud, the restaurant worker with a skimming device in their pocket, swiping cards 25, 30 times a night and then using them fraudulently was the big deal. But now, while that still happens, my unit's more focused on where criminals are going these days, which is the data breaches, where they can hack millions of cards and compromise, way more customers that have been in that way, so they get more bang for their buck. So our focus is more on a 30,000-foot level, looking at the criminal gangs and international organizations that are doing this, looking on the dark web for these cards that are being sold and that type of thing. So that's a little bit about, and the Patriot Act obviously gave us that authority. President Bush gave us the authority to make sure our financial institutions are safeguarded. So we do a lot of that work, our agency, along with the FBI. One of the ways we do that, and this ties directly to Georgia, is partnerships. The Secret Service started a model in 1995 in New York, in our New York field office, with the Electronic Crimes Task Force. We called it ECTF. The purpose of the task force was to get together three groups of people: academia, private industry, and law enforcement on the local, federal, and state level. Today, there's over 40 task forces, electronic crimes task forces, and there's one here in Georgia, the Secret Service, our office, myself and Kevin Walsh from my office oversee that. And we meet to discuss these types of issues collectively as a community and try to address these things. FBI has InfraGard. We encourage folks to be a part of all of them. It's just a way for the community to kind of address new trends and concerns in cybercrime. And we use our partnerships in investigations the same way we do in protection. We're a small agency, we can't do protection by ourselves or in vacuum in the same way with investigations. So one of the ways we're helping to combat really sometimes it's a lack of training in local departments is through our electronic crimes task force. The Secret Service actually gives federal funding to the National Computer Forensic Institute in Hoover, Alabama, NCFI. It's the nation's training center for state law enforcement and judges and prosecutors, because there's actually a little bit of a learning curve in some of this stuff from the prosecutorial side and judge side, believe it or not. They have mock courtrooms. They have the ability to train detectives on network intrusions and forensics. We fund that, and we give them the tools, not only the learning, but the actual equipment, upwards of $80,000 to $100,000 to set up in their own departments. We invite them to work in our lab that we have in our office to kind of learn and continue to grow in their knowledge. And we use that as a force multiplier to address the level of crime that may not reach the federal level. There was some discussion, I'm going to go off script a little bit here, but there was a lot of discussion about, I think Clark Howard mentioned it, the dollar thresholds. That actually, and I don't mean to correct them, but that actually is not, at least in the Northern District of Georgia, which is our federal district here, the sole determining factor in whether or not our case is prosecuted. There are a number of other factors that the U.S. Attorney's Office looks at that is not just a dollar amount, which, don't get me wrong, is a big part of it, but community impact is a big one. We have the federal task force, the federal elderly abuse task force is in existence. So that's if it's involving the elderly, it's obviously a heightened thing. So there's the community impact, organized groups, dollar amount. There's more than one factor that goes into whether or not a case becomes a federal case. So while I don't have any cases, to be quite honest, that are below $250,000, we don't look at the dollar amount as our primary determining factor in whether or not we take the case. So I wanted to just make that clear. If we were to get referred a case that's much smaller, I mean, as a human being, I care about that stuff, and I leverage our partnerships with state, local law enforcement to refer things to them where we may not make a federal case out of it. So that's one of the values of our partnerships and reaching out to law enforcement. We talked about this offline before we started, and this hasn't really been discussed yet, but it's more of a concept of how do we approach cybercrime, with how do we approach this to combat it, whether it's in our families, whether it's in our workplaces, or whether it's in governments and what have you. And this what I'm proposing is a more holistic cyber hygiene approach that doesn't look just at technology. When my kids come home and they get their new iPhone or whatever it is, and I see them with a device, my first reaction is, what app can I put on there to restrict things? How can I monitor them? I'm looking for technology solutions to things, right? In the same way, you're the CEO of a company that has a lot of data or what have you, is very interested in having intrusion detection systems set up at their corporation to make certain that their networks are safe. Those are technology solutions. But in both of those illustrations, none of that is helpful if an employee or my son or my daughter clicks on a malicious link that goes to malware that installs in my computer or their computer device. So what I'm saying is that while technology is important and it shouldn't be dismissed, it's not the only response to this problem. The Verizon Data Breach Report, which some of you may be aware of, is an annual report every year. Secret Service has a big hand in it. And one of the mantras of that report that has been reiterated year after year is the following. It's people, processes, and technology is the way we look at this problem and the solution. In other words, people are often your weakest link. And how do we address that? It's through training, it's through education. And it begins, quite honestly, personally, at the family level, with my own kids, my own dad. I try to do my best to, teach my children about, emails, especially during holiday season, as they start to see things come in from Federal Express or UPS or Amazon that maybe is not accurate. And sharing that with my dad as well regarding some of the romance scams that we're seeing with the elderly, especially right now. So education with people, establishing processes, meaning procedures in place. So in my world, the business email compromise is very big. I'm talking millions of dollars in real estate's a big area where that's happening, because that's where, in construction is another one, where money's happening and being exchanged regularly through wire transfers. These are issues that can often be resolved with a simple phone call, verifying, as Clark Howard said, verifying that the transfer is authorized. Not always, but in many cases could be. Having protocols in place that say certain dollar amounts have to be verified via phone, those type of things. So those are a couple of issues. I wanted to, as I investigate these cases, as my team investigates these cases, we come across really about 8 or 9 things, and you've all heard these before, but I kind of want to maybe give a different tint on it, that are things that people are not doing, whether it's in their home, whether it's in their workplace, or what have you, that really are common vectors for cyber criminals. And these are just countermeasures that are simple things that you can do as an employee, and I would be remiss in this environment not to bring them up. Again, apologize if you know these things, but Clark Howard did not pay me to say the first one, but it's credit freeze. I can't tell you how many people in my own community don't have credit freezes on their own with all 3 credit bureaus. If you freeze your credit, and in Georgia it's very easy to do now with all 3 bureaus, and if you freeze your credit, no one, even you, cannot access your credit for a loan or credit card unless you unfreeze it. And same is true then for the criminal. And it's very simple to do. It's free. If you go to apply for your own credit card or your own auto loan or mortgage, you'll have to unfreeze it. It takes minutes to do. You have to have a PIN number, and it's free now to do. It used to be $3. Now I believe it's free in Georgia. Thank you, sir. I thank you very much, because it used to cost, $9 every time you did that, and now it's free. So, and some credit bureaus make it even easier with apps and things like that. But credit freeze, if people did the credit freeze, it would eliminate so much identity theft, because criminals couldn't access your credit to establish credit or do things. So it's just a great tool. And I notice I didn't say credit alert. Those are tools that are often sold to try to get people to buy. But a credit freeze, if your credit's frozen, you really don't care about alerts because it's frozen. The second thing I want to mention is looking at your accounts regularly. Back in the day, obviously, we got stuff in the mail. But with every bank and everybody using credit cards using apps to, I get text messages when my wife makes a credit card purchase on American Express. Now that's her choice, my choice, but there's no reason nowadays with technology to not be aware of what's happening in your accounts. But so many people, you'd be surprised, have no clue, and they don't even check their monthly. They don't check they're not even aware of what's going in and out. So we just remind folks to do that. Somebody here mentioned two-factor authentication. Basically, that's a fancy way of saying, hey, email and password does no longer cut it. We say that especially when we're doing banking transactions, that there must be a second factor, meaning when I type in my password to log into my bank, the bank should send me like a text message with a code. Okay, that's the second factor. Strong passwords, I mean, this is such an easy thing to say, but so few do it, and but very few people give the correct advice also on this. What I tell my own kids is, think of a password phrase, okay? Think of a sentence, okay? And, I love my high school very much in 2019, okay? Using that phrase, I can take the first letter of each of those words, and I can have a long character password that has a capital letter, letters, numbers, and I'd say at the end, throw a hashtag or an exclamation point as well. You've created a mnemonic, a phrase that you can remember in your head that's not easily crackable by other devices. And it's a great way to have a password. Now, you can also use password generators. I tell all my family members, don't use the notes section of your phone to store passwords. Worse yet, sticky notes on your computer. There are great password keepers that are encrypted that keep your device, your password safe. They also can generate passwords. Two more quick things, or three. Public Wi-Fi, stay off of it in banking. Don't get on public Wi-Fi when banking. I could go on about VPNs. It gets a little technical, but stay off for banking. Shred everything at home. Anything that comes in the mail, banking related, finance related, application related, put it in a shredding. I have in my house. I have a shredding bag, and at the end of the month or every few weeks, I put it in a shredder you can buy at your local store, a crosscut shredder, and shred your stuff, so that people can't then sort through your mail and apply for things. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention skimming devices. This is another thing that my squad is very heavy on at gas pumps across Georgia. You may have heard of this in the news. I actually did a piece on it with Love and Alive a couple of years ago, but it's rearing its head again. Skimming devices are being placed in gas pumps across, the country, quite frankly. And we are advising people that when you pay for your gas at a gas pump, if you're not using cash, use a credit card. If you use your debit card, please don't select the debit function, because when you select debit, you have to put a PIN number in. And if there's a skimming device in the pump, it's not only capturing your card number, but it's capturing your PIN number. And these devices are very, very sophisticated. They're put in pumps, and the bad actors are coming by and they're retrieving the data via Bluetooth technology from the pumps. They're downloading all the credit cards every day. And some of the even more sophisticated ones are cellular based, so they can be overseas or anywhere in the world and get the data back. So they're being using quite good ingenuity in these things. We've already talked about this, the loved one, the arrested, the kidnap calls. We do see some of those. Our other organized fraud unit upstairs sometimes sees those. This is obviously disturbing for all the reasons that have been mentioned, but what we're seeing in this area now that's even more disturbing is the spoofing of phone numbers associated with family members, hospitals, banks, or police departments, what have you. In that when the call comes in to the loved one, and the caller says, "We have your son," and they're calling from what appears to be your son's phone number that's been spoofed, it plays the theory that this myth that people who are victims are dumb or are not smart. In a lot of cases, in many cases, that they're fooled by technology, and we're seeing that they're spoofing phone numbers. They're even playing pre-recorded background messages or background noises to make it sound like there's violence going on in the background, all in an attempt to get the heightened level of panic up so you're not using rational thought when the request comes to make the card purchases, the Green Dot card purchases or Visa card or Home Depot card purchases. So those are the challenges. And lastly, I mean, and there is an element out there of human greed to this too. I would be remiss if I didn't mention this. No one's looking to wire money into your account from a lottery overseas. If you're not accustomed to the social dating circle of attractive models, probably the one emailing you from Russia is Vladimir. So these are obviously, and these are real examples of things that we've seen on a daily basis. Honestly. Again, I want to go back to what I said at the beginning. The people, the processes, the technology as being kind of like, I feel like we have a duty, a responsibility to educate our people, our kids, our schools, educating our kids, our businesses, educating employees, providing them with the methods to conduct business and financial transactions and the correct processes to do that. And then also layering that with the right amount of technology. It's a threefold. In the Secret Service, we call it the layers of protection: outer, middle, and inner perimeter. Same here. It's not one layer. It's multi-layered approach. With that, I would like to just go off script and refer to some of the notes I took in no particular order about some of the things we were discussed here earlier. I talked about the restaurant skimmers and how that's really not something that we're seeing a lot of it. I mean, it does happen, but it's not, criminals are not finding the bang for their buck. That's normally a drug dealer with or a user with a habit that's trying to, yeah. I do too. I do too. Real estate, we talked about business email compromise is probably the business email compromise, aside from ransomware, is the biggest thing nationally right now. There were some questions about where the actors are. Clark Howard hit on it. We're finding them all the countries he mentioned, and some domestic, but a lot of overseas. They are spoofing. They are getting in by phishing attacks, and that's basically me sending you an email, convincing you it's Microsoft. In this case, it's Microsoft Office 360, which many companies have. Thinking they make it look like a real login page for Microsoft Office 360. You click that link to log in. You put in your real email, your real credentials, in what you think is Office 360. It doesn't go. You put it in again, and you've basically given the keys to your email to the criminal. Now they go into your email and they set up rules in your rule folder, unbeknownst to you, forwarding emails to them when you get transactions or things. They put keyword searches in like real estate or closing or whatever, and then at the right time, usually before a closing, they'll inject themselves into the conversation. Sometimes they'll do it from the actual compromised account. Other times they spoof the email address of someone, meaning they register an email domain with one character off, and you don't notice it on the header. And they'll send wiring instructions saying, "We've had a change of the wiring routing numbers. Please wire, $250,000."
It was Bank America that caught it. Thank you, Bank America.
Right.
It wasn't me. It was the bank.
And I want to that point, I want to say that, one of the questions as I was sitting there, where's the hope, right? Where's the hope? And I want to just give let you know there are some success stories. And I feel as a part of the privilege of being in law enforcement is being the voice of people around that are the victims and our job is, quite frankly, to go after the bad guys. We're not a remediation company. We don't go in and fix the company's network when that's a separate private entity that does that. We're there to simply find the bad guys. And we've had success in that, and even with the criminals being largely foreign actors. These aren't cases that take place and conclude in 1 month. I have cases that have been going on for years. And we're about to indict a guy that has been doing business email compromises and recruiting Atlanta-based, we call them mules, to open up accounts at banks to establish locations for money to go through and wire out. And we are actually, contrary to what has been said here a couple times, we are actually able to recover funds provided it's been within 72 hours. So if I get a phone call that from someone that says that we've wired money, and I'm talking about wire transfers, not necessarily store cards or things like that. If we get wire transfers and we're notified that the money has gone, fraudulently from one account or into an account, even if it's overseas, if I know within 72 hours, I can about 90% of the time, and it goes down day by day. First day, about 90%, about 70% after the third day. After the third day, or 72 hours, it's really hard because the money is gone. But we had, what was it, a couple months ago, we had $2 million we seized in 1 month from banks on BEC, business email compromises. And that's going back to the victims. That's not like Secret Service. We're not going out and buying cars with that, okay? That is a success, and but we don't stop there. We're not interested we're not just about seizing things, and we want to find the bad guys. We do have challenges in certain countries. It's no secret that China's one of them, but there are countries where we have relationships with, and we have mutual agreements with. In the areas where we are having where we find it difficult to extradite, we have found that these criminals, they like to vacation in areas that do extradite. So we have done undercover stings to entice them through guys. We make them think that we're women online, and they want to meet us in France, and that's where we pick them up. So we are trying to do our due diligence, I guess you could say, in tackling this problem, albeit at a much higher level. We are on the dark web. Cryptocurrencies are big, is a big hot button now with Bitcoin and how they're using the money to buy using that. We have agents we're training on the dark web to go to these carding sites where they're selling these things and looking at it from a higher level because they are potentially tied to terrorism. These are things that we are doing. Now, traceability, believe it or not, not every criminal is smart, and they are stupid. A lot of them are. And they do go to stores to cash some of these things out, these cards out. So it's old-fashioned investigative work. We do go to Home Depot and we pull video.
That was I was going to ask you earlier. I want to jump in.
Yeah, please.
If you've got the circumstances where cards were bought, it was online things were purchased. You go to pick it up so you can go, as Clark said, fence it and sell it.
Yeah.
Can we not pull video?
We do. We do that all the time. Again, this goes down to it is resources, and I do try to leverage our partnerships with local. If a case came in that was below our monetary and community impact threshold, I would be contacting the police department partners we have and saying, okay, can we get someone over to the Bed Bath & Beyond to pull the video? And yes, it's possible to do that.
And I asked the question because it gets back, and I appreciate Representative Turner's question, because that wasn't front and center of my thinking until he really framed it. But I mean, is there a way that we can create more of a drill? I mean, the things we do regularly, we do very efficiently. And my guess is, this is just a blanket assumption, is that the system's not synchronized enough from someone filing a police report with a sheriff's office all the way through the process of pulling videos, looking and pulling all the things together to, you know, to initiate what could be a very straightforward investigation. My guess is that's not synchronized because it's not what we do.
It's not, and nor are departments set up to handle that. So I'll just use City of Atlanta Police Department. They have an economics crime unit. They are set up to be able to respond and trained, honestly, to respond to some of these things. Whereas you may take a rural Georgia Police Department that has one investigator doing personal crime, property crime, and you know, all these things, and maybe do not have the training to investigate somebody. So it is a training issue, and we are doing our part, again, through the National Computer Forensic Institute to try to get these folks up to speed. It does also become a resource issue for their department, and they got to prioritize. But yeah, there is a lack of standardization across the board there on what the response should be.
But from the perspective of a law enforcement official, the components of looking in a for example, a retailer system as to when this card number was redeemed,
Right.
it was used to make this purchase, which was fulfilled at this point. I mean, it would seem that the components of that, and then the handoff to law enforcement, it would seem that the components of this are not that difficult. It's just that we would need to synchronize all that in a way. The process was put in place that it could be done.
Yeah,
Or are there components of this that
there
are very
are
difficult?
components in place, and going to the store and pulling video is really that's just basic investigation work.
Yeah.
Where we have problems is where we start to say, okay, can you go pull that IP address that routed that request and do a reverse lookup to find out what the domain, so we can pull a subpoena from the. You start talking that language to a detective who has no training. They're giving you the blank stare.
Yeah, right.
In my world, that's basic stuff, and our folks are trained to do that. And so we are partly trainers and educators as well with our partnerships. And you know, it's just that's one weak link that we try to fix.
Is we're living in different worlds. The worlds of investigating stabbings and shootings and home invasion and car theft, and then the world that's in this IP addresses.
Right.
They seem to be very different spheres, and the two don't really. It seems to be across those spheres.
I'm a perfect example. I started in this job, in this career, when this didn't even when we were using floppy disks to share information. And now I've had to, you know, surround myself with knowledgeable people to get up to speed on all this stuff. And so many places across the state and the country really have not. They just haven't done that, and so they're behind the curve. And so again, it's a lot of it is educating our law enforcement officers on this type of crime, cybercrime. And there is a bit of a curve, a little bit of a learning curve.
Okay.
With if there's any other questions, I'm happy to. Those are my kind of prepared remarks. But
Any questions? Chair recognizes Representative Davis for a question.
My question is this. Almost every month or every other month, I'm getting a letter about how my information has been compromised from one large corporation to another. And when I think of my own parents, you know, back in the time when computers didn't even exist, what would you suggest we as lawmakers do going into the future? Because it's not a matter of how often this is going to happen. I think it's commonplace now that this is something that is going to happen to every one of us. Should it be a state law where we, set limits, like the limit of the amount of cards you can buy, maybe at 500 or 1,000 or whatever it may be, and then you have to show some ID. Like nowadays, you can't buy certain drugs without getting a prescription or going in there because it's used to create meth, you know. But individually, that drug may be lawful. What would be your suggestion, working in law enforcement, we should move forward to doing?
to be honest, I haven't thought about from the legislator perspective what especially the state legislative, because I'm federal. To me, my gut reaction is it's not just a legislative issue. I mean, that's maybe part of the problem, and I don't know what the answer is entirely there. For me, and from my perspective as a federal law enforcement officer, the problem is kind of two or threefold. It's the education component. I mean, we do a lot of outreach to we do a lot of outreach to schools, because we have the school safety initiative. Obviously, you may have heard. So we do outreach to schools and kids. It's law enforcement outreach and training on cybercrime, and for us, that's a big component. From the I can't speak to the state legislative side. I don't know that I would be giving good advice there. But for those are our big challenges. Is really the equipping of people in law enforcement for it and educating consumers about it. That's our approach, at least federally.
Yeah. She recognizes Representative Turner.
Wave.
Sure.
A wave.
Okay. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you all.
Appreciate your presence today.
Yes,
What I will want to do is, and again, I know you guys are chasing bad guys. You don't need to be entertaining questions, barrages of questions from state legislators. I just appreciate you being part of being with us today.
Thank you.
But there may be a follow-up to say, hey, if in a perfect world, if we were wanting to resource state law enforcement, and there's such disparities across our state in terms of the smaller, poorer, rural counties versus our better, larger departments. I don't know that there's differences in the people, but there's differences in resources and expertise. This may be a state issue. Georgia has bigger disparities as a state than most states in terms of our haves and our have-nots. So sometimes there is a need for a state solution so that people in rural areas can get the same protections that you would get in a larger area.
Right.
Is there a set of best practices that if you could design an ideal state delivery system, because if these things are not going to be brought by you guys, the U.S. Attorney, is there a best practice that the state of Georgia, if we decide we're serious about this, we could put in place so that interplay of conventional law enforcement and cyber protection, how those things can be brought together in a way that we could deliver it?
There is, and to your point, it kind of ties back to your question. I recently presented on the topic of ransomware to the Fannin County School Board meeting about a month ago, and as you may or may not be aware, ransomware is like the hot topic, and now it's actually hitting school systems across the country, and Georgia's not exempt from that. There have been examples of that, both obviously within the city, but within schools too, and state agencies. So I spoke to Fannin County about it, and we have a white paper that we've actually done from our task force that gave us a series of guidelines for their equivalent of a CISO, Chief Information Security Officer, and their IT folks to set in place, practices to set in place to make certain that they are limiting their liability and limiting their risk. Things like aggregating their networks and or separating their networks and air gapping them, and all these things that are important to avoid ransomware attacks or mitigate them. So yes, to your question, and some I'm reading across the country, there are some states that are actually now using legislation, taking recommendations such as that and making them requirements for school districts, for example, to implement certain things to ensure that their networks are secure and data is secure. So that's just one example. And yes, we do have information we can share that we've done in that area.
But I mean, as an example, Clark talked about the rule of law being shaky in certain countries. I feel like we're blessed that in Georgia in 2019, if there's a murder anywhere, the murder's going to get investigated. That's not something we say, it's not. It's kind of below it wasn't a mass killing, it's below our noise level. We're in a world today that murders are investigated.
Sure.
And certain other violent crimes are investigated because we have the resources. Other places in the third world may even struggle to do that in some places, but we have those resources. If we were to decide, hypothetically, that we want to bring a first-class investigation on every single one of these people who were scanned, hypothetically, I don't know if we have the ability to do that, but if we did, what would that look like? And because of the amount of money that's being stolen, I think if someone's house was broken into and $10,000 of stuff is robbed in Smyrna, I know you've got a first-class police chief, first-class counsel. They would investigate a home breaking with $10,000 of stuff stolen. It's within the sphere of our law enforcement's expectations. I think the challenge we face now, if it's $10,000 that's stolen in this very slick way that's outside of the sphere and expertise of a city law enforcement agency, there's sort of like this inability to go pursue it. And how do we build the skill sets to go pursue $10,000 here more aggressively than we might in a $5,000 home breaking where jewelry was taken and there was a TV taken and there was 2 guns taken? I mean, we know how to do that. And we would do that for $4,000 of a home breaking. But I don't know that we're doing it for $10,000 because, again, it doesn't fit within one person's skill set.
May I suggest that as part of that conversation in the future that a missing piece a piece that may need to be included would be the district attorneys over these areas,
Sure.
because it's not just a law enforcement issue. It's all, I mean, from an investigative side, it's a prosecutorial issue. I mean, they have their own, I mean, I don't want to speak for DAs across Georgia, but they have their own list of priorities as well. And so, you know, we can have all the law enforcement officers in the world trained and bringing these cases to their doorstep, but then they don't have the resources to prosecute them. So I would just encourage you to have, as part of that discussion piece, those people as well.
Yeah.
Yes.
No, I think if Lithuanian criminals find themselves spending 30 years in Reidsville, I think that changes things.
Sure.
I think their experience is they do these things and don't find themselves spending 30 years in Reidsville prison.
Sure.
And I think there's a real incentive. I think you know, crime's going to move to where they can make their profit and the risk is low. And this is a low risk environment because
Absolutely.
we've in essence, not in intention but in practice, we're not prosecuting these things. We're not really bringing the resources to bear we have against these folks. So naturally, crime's going to kind of go there. Is that fair to say?
I think that's one explanation for it. Yeah.
And that's not an indictment. It's just a recognition. It may sound like one. It's not. Not intended to be.
No, I understand.
I think it's a thing a state can address. So, well, folks, it is 12:20. I appreciate your time. I know we were wrapping up 12:15. Thank you for being with us very much.
Thank you.
And
Thank you.
for members of the committee, this is I'd like to get some feedback from each of you guys. If you want to call me or talk afterwards, I'd love to get some feedback about direction we may take with this. And those that came and spoke, thank you. And we stand adjourned.